Hey guys, tonight, we journey back to the muddy, mistrustful corridors of medieval power, where kings don't just rule, they torture, deceive, and sometimes quietly misplace their closest family members. Imagine a castle so damp the walls drip like cold soup, and inside a man wearing a too tight crown is deciding whether you live another day. That's where you are now. And spoiler alert, you probably won't survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with your location and local time. I love seeing how far this sleepy little kingdom of ours stretches. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle into the drafty hall of King John of England, and the first thing you notice is the absence of warmth. Not just in the hearth though, that's barely smouldering, but in the man himself. John's eyes scan the room like he's always expecting betrayal. He often is. It's 1199, and John has just become king after the death of his brother, the legendary Richard the Lionheart. But instead of cheers, he's met with skeptical murmurs. No one forgets that John once tried to snatch the throne while Richard was in captivity. That's right, while Big Bro was chained up in a dungeon. In Germany, John was at home auditioning for the crown, like it was a school play. Spoiler, it didn't go well. He was called Lackland because, well, he didn't own much. After this, he earns a few new nicknames, none of them flattering. You can hear the echo of boots in the corridor. Someone's always being dragged away under John's rule. In fact, he's already eyeing his teenage nephew Arthur of Brittany, a boy with just enough royal blood to be a threat. Arthur's only 16, but that doesn't stop John from throwing him in a dungeon. The kid disappears not long after, and historians still argue whether John personally murdered him, ordered it, or simply let the guards go rogue. But the result is the same. A teenage prince lost to the dark. The nobles start whispering. The French crown sees an opportunity. And John. He tightens his grip. He seizes castles, imposes backbreaking taxes, and invents punishments that'd make even a seasoned torturer wince. One noble, William de Braose, falls out of favor. John demands a massive payment. William's wife refuses. So John locks her and her son in a tower and starves them to death. That slow, silent kind of cruelty that doesn't even need a sword. You smell the rot in the corridors of power. The walls reek of damp parchment and fear. And John, he's always writing. Letters to bishops, edicts, to sheriffs, accusations against anyone who looks at him funny. His reign becomes one long game of paranoia-fueled whack-a-mole. And unlike most kings, John actually reads the fine print on treason. But it's not all dungeons and tax slips. There's a strange moment of accidental greatness. In 1215, his bullying of the barons reaches such fever pitch that they force him to sign Magna Carta, a document that limits the king's power, basically the medieval version of "you're not the boss of me." Of course, John has no intention of following it. He signs with one hand and starts plotting with the other. A few months later, he's at war with his own nobles again. By now, even the church is fed up. Pope Innocent III literally excommunicates him. That's a medieval, blocked and reported. It means no sacraments, no support, and if you die, well, good luck on the judgment part. But John, being John, somehow manages to worm his way back into the Pope's good graces. He offers England itself as a papal fiefdom, basically, "Hey Pope, wanna own us? I'll be your vassal." And just like that, the Pope lifts the ban. Talk about a divine PR save. Still, nothing redeems John in the eyes of his own people. The barons eventually invite the French Prince Louis to invade. You know it's bad when your nobles would rather swap out you for a French guy. And John flees. He loses treasure in a bog, literally drops the royal jewels into the swamp, like some tragic cartoon king. That image sticks, drenched, muddy, and now broke. He dies not long after in 1216, supposedly from dysentery. It's an inglorious end for a man who once fancied himself an emperor. He leaves behind a kingdom in chaos, and a son, Henry III, who gets to spend most of his reign trying to undo the damage. Modern historians try to cut John a bit of slack. They say the barons were power-hungry too. They mention how difficult it was to keep order in such a fractured feudal mess. But none of that excuses starving kids in towers, or turning castles into tombs, or demanding scutage attacks for not going to war so often it became a running joke. And here's the fringe detail: John was obsessed with astrology, not the fun kind either. The dark, medieval, when will I die kind. He allegedly refused to enter battle on certain days because of star alignments. Imagine checking your horoscope before declaring war. So what do you call a king like that? Cruel, cowardly, maybe just cursed. Even Shakespeare couldn't resist him penning a whole tragedy titled King John. Though even there he gets upstaged by the younger characters. Maybe that's fitting. Because in life he was always the brother, the uncle, the afterthought trying to wear a crown too heavy for his head. You leave his crumbling castle now. Behind you the torchlight flickers in narrow passages. Somewhere a forgotten cell door creaks shut. And in the distance you hear laughter, but it's the dry kind. The kind that echoes long after the joke's over. You don't walk through this next court, you tiptoe. The floor feels uneven, like someone's buried secrets beneath it. Because you've just entered the shadowed throne room of Charles VI of France, better known as Charles the Mad. And while other kings earned their cruelty with swords, Charles perfected a different brand of terror confusion. At first, everything looks normal. Gilded arches, velvet tapestries, perfumed courtiers smiling too wide. But watch their eyes, they never linger too long on the king. And when he speaks, they flinch, waiting to see which Charles has shown up today. The kind one who hands out coins to beggars, or the one who thinks he's made of glass and might shatter if you look at him wrong. Charles was only 11 when he became king in 1380. A child surrounded by uncles who smiled at him like wolves sizing up a calf. His early reign was mostly them ruling in his name, draining France's treasury faster than you can say fleur-de-lis. But by 17, Charles took control, and for a brief bright moment it seemed he might actually rule well. Then came the ride through Le Mans forest. Picture it, the king on horseback, banners fluttering, armor gleaming. Then out of nowhere, a servant drops a lance behind them with a loud clatter. Charles spins, draws his sword and attacks. Not the enemy, his own escort. He kills 4 men before they can subdue him. When he comes to, he has no memory of the attack. Just blood on his hands and questions in his eyes. That's the moment everything shifts. From that day on, the French court becomes a haunted house. Charles suffers recurring psychotic episodes. Sometimes he doesn't recognize his wife. Sometimes he runs screaming down hallways, believing he's being chased by enemies that aren't there. And yes, there's the infamous glass delusion, where he insists he's made of fragile crystal and wears reinforced clothing to avoid shattering. Historians still argue whether this was schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or something no DSM code could ever capture. The court physicians don't help. Their treatments include bleeding potions of boiled herbs and the occasional prayer marathon. You can almost smell the burnt rosemary and old fear mingling in the corridors. But the real cruelty, it's not just Charles's mind. It's how his illness becomes the crown's playground. Behind his back, his uncles and cousins start slicing up France like a stale baguette. The Duke of Burgundy versus the Duke of Orléans. Blood feuds erupt in alleys and palaces alike. One of them, Louis of Orléans, even flirts with Charles's queen, Isabeau of Bavaria. Scandal. Yes, subtle, not remotely. The rivalry turns deadly in 1407, when Louis is straight up axed in the street by assassins. His blood stains the stones of Paris, and Charles, well, he might have cared if he'd been lucid, but he wasn't. So France falls further into chaos. And then there's the most surreal moment, the Bal des Ardents, the Ball of the Burning Men. It sounds like a rave, but it's really a masquerade gone murderously wrong. Charles and some friends dress up as wild men, covering themselves in pitch and feathers. Great party right, until a torch gets too close and 4 men are roasted alive in front of the Queen. Charles barely survives. You can still smell the singed hair centuries later. Here's your quirky fact. After that disaster, bonfires were temporarily banned in Paris parties. Yes, medieval fire safety brought to you by a royal near BBQ. The 100 Years' War worsens everything. France is already bleeding from internal strife, and England sees a golden opportunity. Enter Henry V. You know that Henry, the one from Shakespeare. In 1415, he demolishes the French army at Agincourt. Thousands of knights trapped in mud, cut down like wheat. And Charles. He's locked in a tower, murmuring to walls while courtiers use his name to issue contradictory orders. In 1420, the Treaty of Troy is signed, possibly the most humiliating peace ever. It disinherits Charles's own son, the Dauphin, and declares Henry V as heir to the French throne, all while Charles's name is still on the royal seal. Technically, he agreed to give his crown to his enemy. Though whether he understood what he was doing is a scholarly debate still argued today. Isabeau signs it too. Whether out of desperation or ambition, no one knows. Some say she betrayed France. Others say she saved it from total collapse. Either way, the country splits like a cracked mirror. Armagnacs versus Burgundians, each claiming to speak for a king who's talking to chairs. Charles VI finally dies in 1422. Not with a roar, but a whimper. He's buried in Saint-Denis, but honestly, France breathes a sigh of relief. The reign of a mad king is over. His son, Charles VII, starts putting the pieces back together, with a little help from a girl named Joan of Arc, but we'll get to her in another story. Even now, when you look at Charles's portrait, there's something off. The eyes, the tilt of the mouth. He's not remembered with rage or admiration, but with a kind of historical shudder. Cruelty, after all, isn't always about what you do. Sometimes it's what you allow. And the real victims weren't just his slaughtered knights or burned dancers. It was France itself bled dry, while a mad king rocked in a velvet chair, mumbling nonsense as wolves in silk tore the nation apart. So you turn from that cold throne where the air never quite warms, and as you walk away, the wind behind you sounds almost like laughter or screaming. Hard to tell. You feel it before you see it. Something dark, something sharp. The scent of pine ash and blood hangs in the chill air as you enter the dense forests of Wallachia. The trees whisper tales of impaled bodies, and the birds fly higher here as if they know not to land too close. Because tonight you walk beside Vlad III, better known as Vlad the Impaler, or for the fans of Gothic horror, Dracula. Born in 1431 in Transylvania, yes, that Transylvania Vlad's childhood is anything but soft. His father, Vlad II Dracul, is a noble juggling Hungarian alliances and Ottoman threats like flaming daggers. And little Vlad, he's a political pawn before he hits puberty. At age 11, he and his brother Radu are handed over to the Ottoman Sultan as hostages, part peace treaty, part subtle behave or else. In the Ottoman court, Vlad learns Turkish military strategy and arguably how betrayal stings deeper than a sword. He also learns that cruelty isn't just allowed, it's strategic. But unlike his charming popular brother Radu, Vlad is intense, quiet, brooding. The kind of kid who doesn't just pull wings off flies, he probably keeps a journal about it. When his father is assassinated back home, and his older brother is buried alive by Wallachian nobles, yes, buried alive, Vlad returns to reclaim his birthright. And he doesn't just want the throne. He wants revenge, redemption, and absolute control. He gets it in 1456. The throne of Wallachia is his, and he wastes no time making a statement. His first act, a banquet. He invites hundreds of nobles, many of whom helped kill his father and brother. They dine well. They toast the new prince. Then he arrests them. The older ones are impaled. The younger ones are marched 50 miles to build his fortress at Poenari. Those who survive eat their own belts to stay alive. Welcome to Vlad's reign. And now, let's talk about the impaling. Yes, it's real, and yes, it's as bad as you think. Vlad perfects it. Victims are impaled on long wooden stakes, blunt, not sharp, so the body slides slowly down without dying too quickly. The stakes are arranged in patterns, circles, forests, even geometric designs. The higher the stake, the higher the status of the person being punished. One German pamphlet claimed he impaled over 20,000 people in a single campaign. Historians still argue whether that number's real or just 15th century tabloid flair. But one thing's sure, people saw, remembered, and were absolutely terrified. He didn't just impale soldiers. He impaled merchants who overcharged, lovers who cheated, even a mistress who claimed to be pregnant when she wasn't. His message was clear: justice in Vlad's realm comes with a pointed end. Here's your quirky tidbit. Vlad reportedly left a golden cup at a public fountain in Târgoviște. It stayed there untouched for years. Why? Because even thieves knew better. In Vlad's Wallachia, crime wasn't just punished. It was punished publicly, creatively, and with maximal psychological trauma. But Vlad wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake, at least not entirely. He was trying to rule a volatile, war-torn region wedged between empires. The Ottomans to the south, the Hungarians to the north. His people were fractious, rebellious, and constantly scheming. Fear was Vlad's currency, and it worked, for a while. Then came 1462. Sultan Mehmed II, fresh off conquering Constantinople, marches toward Wallachia with a massive army. Most rulers would flee. Vlad. He unleashes guerrilla warfare, poisons wells, burns fields, and even sends diseased men into enemy camps. And then his masterpiece, the night attack. You hear hoofbeats in the dark. You smell smoke and sweat. Vlad leads a surprise cavalry charge directly into the Ottoman camp at night, aiming to assassinate the Sultan. He fails to kill him, but the terror he sows is immense. Mehmed finds rows of impaled bodies, some say 20,000, outside Târgoviște. The Sultan turns back. Still, Vlad's enemies aren't just foreign. His own nobles, ever scheming, eventually betray him. He's captured by the Hungarians and spends years in captivity. Irony, while imprisoned, he probably dines with Hungarian nobility and even befriends Matthias Corvinus the king. Because medieval politics is basically one long, awkward dinner party with knives under the table. Eventually, Vlad regains power briefly in 1476, but not for long. He's ambushed and killed, some say, by enemies. Some whisper his own men turned on him. His head is sent to the Sultan preserved in honey. A gruesome souvenir even by 15th century standards. So where's the cruelty here? Was Vlad a sadist or a survivor? Historians still argue about it. Romanian sources paint him as a national hero who stood up to foreign domination. German pamphlets, mostly from merchants he punished, portray him as a literal monster. The truth, as usual, probably lies somewhere in the muck and blood in between. And then there's the legend he inspired Dracula. Bram Stoker took the name the Transylvanian setting and sprinkled in some vampire lore. But the real Vlad was more terrifying than any fictional count, because he didn't need fangs to drain life, just a wooden stake and a message: obey or be art. As you step back from the blood-soaked ground, you notice the silence. No birds, no whispers, just the soft creak of wind passing through the stakes. And in that stillness, you wonder, was Vlad the Impaler a product of his time? Or did he shape the time to fit his nightmare? Either way, you keep walking, slowly, and never with your back turned. The dust here never settles. You feel it grind between your teeth, clinging to your tongue with a taste like dried iron. You've crossed from Europe to the Middle East, and now the heat presses against your skin like judgment. Welcome to the world of Al-Hakim bi Amr Allah, Caliph of the Fatimid dynasty in Cairo, and one of the most perplexing and, yes, cruel rulers the medieval Islamic world ever endured. He doesn't look like a tyrant at first glance. Born in 985, Al-Hakim is just 11 when he inherits the caliphate. Think about that, barely old enough to write poetry, yet he controls a kingdom that spans Egypt, North Africa, and the Levant. At first he rules under a regent, but by age 15 he grabs the reins himself, and the ride gets bumpy. Very bumpy. Al-Hakim starts with reforms. He lowers taxes, improves trade, even opens Islamic schools and libraries. For a brief time, people call him just and wise. But then, just like flipping a coin, his rule turns into something darker. And the deeper you go, the more surreal it becomes. Let's start. Light al-Hakim bans grapes, not wine grapes. Then he bans watercress. Then he bans shellfish. And after that, women from appearing in public baths. No big deal. Sure, until it escalates. Soon, women can't leave their homes at all, not even with veils. Shoemakers are forbidden from crafting women's shoes. The message is clear: no feet, no freedom. He doesn't stop there. Al-Hakim bans chess music and singing. He bans meat during certain days of the week. Then he mandates nightly patrols to ensure people are behaving. Imagine trying to sneak a grilled shrimp while some guy with a spear is checking if your sandals are government approved. Quirky fact for you. During one of his stranger phases, Al-Hakim apparently tried to regulate how much daylight people got. He ordered merchants to shut shops early and banned nighttime work, effectively forcing Cairo to live by his own circadian rhythm. But the cruelty wasn't quirky for long. Christian and Jewish populations in Cairo had once lived relatively freely under Fatimid rule. That changed under Al-Hakim. In 1004, he bans Christian celebrations like Epiphany and Easter. In 1009, he goes further, much further. He orders the complete destruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, one of Christianity's holiest sites. That act ripples far beyond Cairo. Historians still argue whether this destruction helped plant seeds for the First Crusade decades later. But the shock across Christendom was instant, and back in Egypt, Christians are forced to wear large crosses around their necks. Jews are given heavy wooden calf necklaces. Both groups face public humiliation, restricted jobs, and sudden arrests. Then, there are the executions of noble scholars, even palace servants. One day, Al-Hakim praises a vizier. The next, that same man is publicly flayed. He once had palace guards slit the throats of dogs because their barking annoyed him. No joke. And yet, there's a twist. Some worship him. Yes, truly. In the mountains of Lebanon, a new sect emerges that believes Al-Hakim isn't just a man, he's divine. They believe he's an incarnation of God, sent to lead the faithful into cosmic unity. These followers eventually become the Druze, a secretive religious group that still exists today. Now pause and process that while he's banning melons and executing bakers, other people are kneeling before him, whispering prayers. If that's not a medieval paradox, what is? He even builds a massive house of wisdom, Dar al-Hikmah, stocked with books, scholars and scrolls. His regime funds astronomers and philosophers. You could be writing poetry about moonlight on Tuesday and be on a torture rack by Thursday. Cairo becomes a city of whispers. People walk carefully, speak softly, look over their shoulders before they hum a tune or drink from a banned water source. It's not just fear of death, it's fear of absurdity. One wrong color of clothing, one misquoted verse, and you're gone. Then in 1021, Al-Hakim disappears, vanishes. His donkey returns without him, saddle wet with blood. Some say he was assassinated by his sister Sit al-Mulk. Others believe he faked his death and wandered into the mountains. The Druze insist he never died at all. They say he entered occultation, a kind of holy hiding, and will return at the end of time. There's still a mosque in Cairo bearing his name. It stands like a question mark in stone. So where does the cruelty lie? In the randomness, the unpredictability, the way law becomes whim and whim becomes doctrine. In Al-Hakim's world, order is illusion, and your life might hinge on whether he woke up that day craving radishes or divine vengeance. People compare him to Caligula, to Nero, but unlike those emperors, Al-Hakim cloaked his madness in philosophy, in metaphysics. He wasn't a fool, he was a philosopher king with a dagger under his scroll. And now, as you walk away from the ghost of his court, you feel unsteady. Not because of the dust, but because his story rattles something deep. The realization that the most dangerous rulers aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they come draped in silence, speaking softly about light and truth while darkness curls behind their teeth. You pass through a veil of mist, and the air thickens sweet and foul, like perfume spilled on something rotten. Now you're in Paris, but not the romantic moonlit Paris of accordion music and candlelit cafes. No, this is the 14th century. There are no croissants. There is no Eiffel Tower. What there is a teenage king with a crown too big for his head and shadows leaking from the corners of his mind. This is Charles VI of France, called Charles the Beloved in the beginning, but Charles the Mad by the end. He's crowned at just 11 years old, but real power doesn't come until he's 20. And at first, things look promising. Charles is handsome, athletic, even charismatic. He throws elaborate tournaments, rides with his knights, and tries to unify a fractured France still licking wounds from the 100 Years' War. His court is lavish, his robes velvet, his hair always just so. But the cracks start early. A strange aggression, sudden memory lapses, insomnia that stretches for days. And then one summer day in 1392, everything changes. Charles is riding through a forest with his knights headed toward Brittany to punish a traitor. The heat is stifling the horses, restless. Suddenly, a man, barefoot, wild-eyed, leaps from the woods and grabs the king's bridle, shrieking, "Don't ride any farther, noble king, you are betrayed." He's dragged off beaten and the journey continues. But the seed is planted. That afternoon in a clearing baked under the sun, Charles snaps. A knight drops a lance. The clatter echoes. Charles draws his sword and attacks. He kills 4 of his own men before being wrestled to the ground. His eyes are vacant. His mouth foams. When he finally collapses, he doesn't recognize his wife, his children, or even his own name. Welcome to Charles's first full psychotic break. From here, it only gets worse. Charles begins slipping in and out of delusions. Sometimes he believes he's made of glass. Truly. He has iron rods sewn into his clothes to protect himself from shattering. He refuses to be touched, sits motionless for hours, and orders servants to tiptoe so they won't crack his fragile limbs. This is not a metaphor. This is his reality. And then comes the filth. He forgets how to bathe. He soils himself openly. He howls like a wolf in the middle of the night, gnawing on bedding and shrieking at mirrors. He once refused to change clothes for 5 months. And through it all, he remains King of France. Now, the real cruelty here isn't in what Charles does to others, but in what others do while he's spiraling. France becomes a chessboard of opportunists. His cousin, the Duke of Burgundy, and his brother, the Duke of Orléans, each take turns ruling in his name and stabbing each other metaphorically and sometimes literally in the back. They both claim to act on behalf of the king, but really, it's about power, money, and influence. The Burgundians control Paris. The Armagnacs rally in the countryside. France fractures again, a civil war blooming inside the larger 100 Years' War with England. And Charles, he drifts. There are moments when he seems lucid. He recognizes his daughter, recites poetry, holds court, but they never last. It's like he's underwater, surfacing only to gasp before the weight drags him down again. His physicians try everything: leeches, herbal concoctions, prayer. One cure involves baking him in a hot oven. Shockingly, it doesn't help. Here's your fringe tidbit during one of his glassy episodes. Charles reportedly banned mirrors from his chambers because seeing himself might confirm he no longer existed. Think about that. He feared visibility, feared being made real. One winter, Charles forgets he's king, refers to himself in the third person, then insists the king is dead. His courtiers scramble to maintain illusions, staging little plays to remind him of who he is. Imagine having to pantomime your monarch's identity just to keep your head attached. And here comes the cruelty again, not from Charles, but in how his reign becomes a puppet show. His wife Isabeau of Bavaria, once beloved, becomes a political target. She's accused of infidelity, of witchcraft, of conspiring with enemies. She's forced to play caretaker queen and scapegoat all at once. Her children are used as pawns, married off to seal alliances made by whoever is temporarily in charge of Charles's body. Then there's the infamous Treaty of Troyes. In 1420, with Charles too far gone to object, His advisors declare that after his death, the crown will pass not to his son, the Dauphin Charles, but to Henry V of England, his daughter's husband. It's like selling the kingdom while the king drools in the corner. And France, well, France burns. Historians still argue whether Charles was schizophrenic, manic depressive, or suffering from a neurological condition caused by mercury poisoning or genetic madness. Whatever the case, his illness becomes national tragedy. Not just a personal breakdown, but a country's. And yet, in the few slivers of clarity, Charles seems to know what's happening. Once, after months of silence, he reportedly looked at a courtier and whispered, "My crown has been stolen by shadows." Haunting. When he dies in 1422, he's 53, having reigned for over 40 years. But his legacy is one of collapse. France is shattered, its monarchy humiliated, and his own bloodline nearly erased by treaty. The Mad King becomes a cautionary tale, a footnote in royal disasters. But here's what lingers: the sense that madness, when it lives on a throne, doesn't just haunt a palace. It infects every edict, every war, every child married off to stop the bleeding. It turns governance into theatre and suffering into strategy. So you leave Charles VI behind, stepping away from the chill of his stone chambers, where the walls once echoed with growls and poetry alike. Where glass wasn't just fragile, it was flesh, and the monsters weren't always in the king's head. Sometimes they wore crowns of their own. Your footsteps crunch on frosty ground, now mist curling around your ankles like something alive. Northward, deep into Scandinavia, the land of jagged coastlines, brooding fjords and monarchs with names carved into sagas. You expect honor and oaths, longboats and hall feasts. But instead, you find Christian II of Denmark, a man who takes the Viking spirit, boils it in paranoia, and spills it across 3 kingdoms. Let's set the stage. It's the early 1500s, and Christian rules over Denmark, Norway, and Sweden under something called the Kalmar Union, a sort of medieval Nordic merger. But the alliance is shaky, and Sweden always grumbling for independence. Enter Christian, determined to hold everything together with a smile and a sword. At first glance, he's not your typical tyrant. He's educated, speaks multiple languages, and even flirts with Renaissance ideas. He introduces legal reforms, tries to curtail noble power, and plot twist grants some protections to peasants. On paper, he's a modern ruler. But look closer and you see the danger. Christian's mind is a storm. One historian called him the last medieval king and the first Renaissance dictator. A man suspended between chivalry and cold-blooded governance, who smiles with his mouth and plots with his pen. Things boil over in 1520. After years of tension with Swedish nobility, Christian invades. His army, including German mercenaries, defeats the Swedes at Uppsala. Then he marches into Stockholm, claiming victory. He's even crowned King of Sweden with a lavish ceremony, handing out pardons like confetti. The Swedish elite relax. Maybe this won't be so bad. And that's when he turns. Just days after the celebrations, Christian orders the gates of Stockholm closed. No one in, no one out. Then, over 3 brutal days, his men arrest, try and execute nearly 100 Swedish nobles, bishops, scholars, even people who had supported him. Their bodies are paraded through the streets, heads displayed, and blood soaks the cobblestones. Some are beheaded, others hanged, a few reportedly buried alive. This bloodbath becomes known as the Stockholm bloodbath. And Christian, he watches from a window, calm, quiet, as if observing a weather report. Here's your fringe tidbit. He supposedly ordered the bodies of the executed left out to rot, claiming their decay would remind the people of the price of rebellion. It didn't remind, it enraged. Sweden erupts in rebellion again, this time led by Gustav Vasa, whose family had been slaughtered. Christian's heavy-handed cruelty backfires spectacularly. Within 2 years, he's lost Sweden for good, and Gustav becomes king. So now Christian returns to Denmark, but he's changed. Paranoia coils around him like fog. He doesn't trust nobles or bishops or even his own advisors. He installs foreign loyalists, including Dutch merchants and Germans, which inflames the Danish elite. He begins purging his court. Friends vanish overnight. Executions become regular punctuation. His own wife, Isabella of Austria, grows distant, and his mistress, Dyveke Sigbritsdatter, becomes a central figure. Dyveke's mother, Sigbrit, a merchant's widow with no noble blood, gains enormous power behind the scenes. She essentially runs the economy. This, of course, enrages the Danish aristocracy. They hate being bossed around by a woman who once sold oranges in Bergen, but Christian stands by her. In fact, when Dyveke mysteriously dies, possibly poisoned, Christian loses what little composure he had left. He executes a nobleman, Torben Oxe, whom he thinks was responsible. No trial, just an accusation and a swift blade. And from there it's a downward spiral. The nobles revolt. The Catholic Church turns on him. Even his allies whisper behind his back. By 1523, he's overthrown by his own uncle, Frederick I. Christian flees Denmark in disgrace, exiled with a small band of followers and apparently a few trunks of gold teeth pulled from executed prisoners. Yes, really. But he doesn't give up. In a move that feels more theatrical than strategic, Christian gathers a ragtag army and sails back toward Norway in 1531, hoping to retake his throne. He promises reform clemency, a kinder rule, but no one buys it. He's captured and handed over to his enemies. And here's the twist: they don't execute him. They imprison him, not for a month, not a year, but for nearly 3 decades. Christian II lives the rest of his life in various Danish castles, a king in name only locked away, while Europe changes around him. Martin Luther, the Reformation. The rise of modern statecraft. Christian watches it all from behind bars. During his imprisonment, he writes letters, some poetic, some unhinged. He talks of redemption, of visions of dreams, where he still sits on a throne. But those dreams never come true. He dies in 1559, aged 78, forgotten by most, feared by a few. And that's the legacy of Christian II. Not just the Stockholm bloodbath, though, that's the headline. The real cruelty is how quickly he shifted from reformer to butcher, from philosopher king to paranoid tyrant. He thought he could rule through fear and survive on charm. But terror burns bridges. And once they're gone, there's no crossing back. Historians still argue whether Christian was a reformer betrayed by nobles or a despot in disguise using progress as a mask. Either way, the bodies in Stockholm speak louder than his reforms ever did. So now you leave the icy north stepping over cobblestones still echoing with ghostly screams. Christian II fades behind you, a man who could have changed history. If only he hadn't tried to choke it first. You drift now toward the Mediterranean, where the air grows warm and heavy with jasmine and secrets. Southern Italy rolls beneath you, sunlit hills, crumbling castles, lemon trees, but don't be fooled. You're heading straight into the heart of medieval Naples. And waiting for you there is someone they called the Butcher King. Welcome to the court of Ferdinand the Foreign of Naples. This is not Ferdinand of Aragon, the big-name Ferdinand married to Isabella of Spain. No, this is Ferdinand of Naples, a man whose cruelty earned him comparisons to Nero, Caligula, and just about every tyrant who ever toyed with people like chess pieces. Ferdinand, or Ferrante, as he's known locally, rules from 1458 to 1494. And he starts strong, smart, energetic, tactically brilliant. He stabilizes the kingdom after a turbulent succession, crisis strengthens the economy, and even promotes culture. At first glance, you might think you're in the presence of a Renaissance ruler, someone who appreciates science, poetry, even tax reform. But then you notice the dungeons. Hidden beneath his palaces are intricate systems of tunnels and cells, some filled with chains, others with spikes, one rumored to be entirely soundproof so screams don't escape. Ferdinand isn't just paranoid. He's a connoisseur of vengeance. He collects his enemies like fine wine and lets them ferment. Here's where it gets delightfully disturbing. Whenever someone plots against him, and people do often, he doesn't just execute them. Oh no, That's too boring. He lures them in, pretends to forgive them, hosts a banquet, toasts to peace, smiles like a long-lost uncle, and then they disappear. Down into the stone belly of his palace they go, often shackled, sometimes blindfolded. Months, even years pass. No one speaks of them. The court tiptoes on eggshells, and then just when you think they've been forgotten, Ferdinand holds another party, and he brings them out. Not alive, not quite. He unveils their embalmed corpses dressed in fine robes posed at the dinner table like guests of honor. Imagine sipping wine while your cousin who tried to poison the king 6 years ago sits across from you with glassy, taxidermied eyes. That's not just cruelty, that's performance art. Mainstream historians confirm the embalming, by the way. Ferrante kept a collection of preserved traitors, his own little wax museum of warning. Some say he had up to 20 bodies perfectly preserved brought out on feast days to remind the nobles what happened to disloyal men. You wonder what dinner conversation must have sounded like at that table. Ferdinand's court is a study in contrasts. On the one hand, it sparkles with artists, architects, diplomats. He builds libraries, funds, translations of Greek texts, and hosts some of the sharpest minds in Europe. But step too far out of line, and suddenly your name disappears from records. Your estate seized. Your wife mysteriously remarried to a loyalist. He doesn't shout, he doesn't rage, he just waits. Here's your quirky fringe tidbit. Ferdinand was obsessed with astrology. He wouldn't sign treaties or attend meetings unless the stars were favorable. One report claims he postponed a critical battle because Mercury was in retrograde. Spoiler, the delay cost him a strategic city. But hey, no hard feelings, he just executed the general who suggested fighting anyway. And yes, he fought a lot. Naples is a juicy prize, and everyone wants a bite, especially the French. Ferdinand defends his throne multiple times, most notably against the invasion of Charles VIII of France. He wins through cunning bribery and occasionally just plain disappearing opponents in the middle of the night. Now, despite all the terror, some subjects genuinely admire him. He keeps bandits in check, maintains infrastructure, even initiates land reforms that help the common folk. To peasants, he's more stable than sympathetic, but they know better than to speak out. You praise Ferrante when asked, or you vanish. Historians still argue whether Ferdinand's cruelty was strategic or compulsive. Was he just reacting to a dangerous time, or did he genuinely enjoy the control? His embalming hobby certainly suggests the latter. But some scholars note he never unleashed violence blindly, only when he felt threatened, which, to be fair, was frequently. And then there's the family drama. Ferrante's own son, Alfonso, grows up in the glow and the shadow of his father. By the end of Ferdinand's reign, Alfonso inherits not just a throne, but a palace filled with mummified warnings. You can almost imagine his internal monologue. Thanks, Dad. No pressure. As Ferrante ages, he becomes more reclusive, still sharp, still deadly, but quieter. His enemies are fewer, mostly because most are dead. By the time he dies in 1494, Naples has become both a Renaissance jewel and a pressure cooker. His court breathes a cautious sigh of relief, and then ironically Naples falls apart. The French invade. The nobles rebel. All the terror Ferrante used to hold the kingdom together gone. Without his paranoia, Naples becomes a mess of competing factions. You realize perhaps that his cruelty was also glue-twisted, yes, but effective. So now you step out of the Neapolitan palace, the flicker of torchlight reflecting off preserved eyes and skeletal grins. Ferdinand, I remains behind you, smiling forever, in portraits lurking forever in footnotes. A king who turned embalming into a political tool and fear into a throne room centerpiece. As you walk away, you wonder, was it better to be ruled by someone cruel and cunning, or kind and powerless? The wind in the olive groves offers no answer. Now your feet move westward to a place where the sands hiss with ancient whispers and the air hums with tension. North Africa, home of desert's minarets, and a monarch so terrifying He made neighboring kings offer tributes just to be left alone. You've arrived in the golden palaces of Morocco, face to face with Sultan Moulay Ismail, the bloodthirsty king. He ruled from 1672 to 1727. That's 55 years, one of the longest reigns in history. And every single year drenched in cruelty, ambition, and the iron will of a man who believed God put him on earth to rule through terror. Moulay Ismail, founder of the Alawite dynasty, didn't just want to control Morocco. He wanted to reshape it, every grain of sand, every city gate, every soul. His first act, crushing rebellion. He personally led armies to silence rival tribes. Cities were razed, entire families extinguished. His message was clear: obedience or extinction. And the executions, they weren't quiet. He'd impale rebels on long stakes outside city walls, their bodies left to rot under the sun. Heads decorated entrances. Eyeballs, according to one traveller, were sometimes scooped out and sent to surviving relatives as, let's call it, a conversation starter. But wait, it gets better. He had a black slave army known as the Abid al-Bukhari, not just a few guards. We're talking 150,000 enslaved men, trained from childhood, fiercely loyal. He imported women from across West Africa to birth this army. Some estimates claim he fathered over 1,000 children. The Guinness World Records has him as the most prolific father in human history. You're not dreaming. That's real. His harem reportedly included over 500 concubines. If one looked sideways, even once, she might be buried alive. Eunuchs ran the palace like a military base, ensuring strict control. Historians still argue whether this structure made Morocco more stable or simply more terrifying. One mainstream fact: his capital, Meknes, became known as the Versailles of North Africa. Moulay ordered a city of grandeur. Palaces, mosques, massive granaries, stables, for 12,000 horses, all built by slaves, war captives, and conscripted laborers. If you slowed down, you were whipped. If you talked back, you vanished. Now here's your quirky tidbit. Some stories say Moulay loved to test his swords by slicing through prisoners in a single blow. One legend claims he once decapitated 6 prisoners with one swing. Probably exaggerated, but it tells you everything about the man's image management. He also had a thing for beheading people himself, not through executioners personally, while sipping tea, while hosting envoys, even during breakfast. An ambassador from France once described watching him calmly speak about diplomacy while casually killing a servant who had spilled a tray. And speaking of France, Louis XIV, the son. King himself got a polite letter from Moulay once. The letter included a marriage proposal to Louis's daughter. Moulay Ismail wanted a royal alliance. Louis declined. Moulay responded with a note saying, France must be decadent and weak, and then raised tariffs on French goods. For decades, European envoys tried negotiating with him. Most left quickly. Some never left at all. One was reportedly kept in a cell for 22 years, emerging toothless, white-haired, and nearly blind. His crime delivering news the Sultan didn't like. And yes, this man built things. He modernized Morocco's army, strengthened fortresses, opened ports, crushed pirates when it suited him. His empire was feared and respected. But the cost. Oh, the cost. One chronicler estimates 30,000 people were killed during construction of his palace complex alone. That's more than the population of some cities back then. And the pace of killing never slowed. Public executions were weekly affairs, sometimes just to keep fear fresh. Here's another little wrinkle. Despite all this, some historians argue Moulay Ismail brought unprecedented unity and order to Morocco. Before him, it was tribal chaos. After him, a centralized, brutal but functioning kingdom. So was he a necessary evil, a cruel reformer? Or just a man drunk on power and blood? Scholars debate this like it's a medieval morality puzzle. Toward the end of his life, the killings didn't stop. If anything, they became more erratic. He'd order mass executions for minor insults. He once burned an entire district because someone scrawled graffiti criticizing attacks. He executed his own son over suspicions of betrayal, then mourned for weeks. He lived into his 80s, incredibly finally dying in 1727, probably from natural causes, though some say poison. With him gone, Morocco staggered into civil unrest. His sons fought over succession, and the kingdom he held together with blood unraveled at the seams. So as you step past the sunlit ruins of Meknes, you feel his ghost not in whispers, but in command. The air still carries the weight of obedience. Even the shadows seem organized. Moulay Ismail ruled with a cruelty so absolute it became policy, ritual, legacy, and yet he's still considered a founding father of modern Morocco. His descendants still rule. His portrait hangs in museums. Statues rise polished by time and uneasy reverence. That's the trouble with cruel kings. History doesn't always punish them. Sometimes it preserves them. You're still in the Islamic world, but now the desert gives way to glimmering tiles, scent-heavy bazaars, and opulent halls of the Ottoman Empire. Time slows. The air thickens with incense and politics. You glide toward Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, into the chambers of a sultan so feared, so ruthlessly efficient, that even his own sons trembled in his presence. Meet Sultan Selim, better known as Selim the Grim. He rules from 1512 to 1520, a short reign by some standards, but what he lacks in years, he makes up for in raw, unfiltered brutality. In just 8 years, he doubles the size of the Ottoman Empire. That's right, doubles. And how through a dizzying mix of war, execution, intimidation, and some of the iciest family drama in recorded history, Selim doesn't wait politely for his turn on the throne. He takes it. His father, Bayezid II, had several sons. As you can guess, Ottoman succession wasn't decided by birth order. It was survival of the most ruthless. Selim, seeing the writing on the wall, raises an army, marches on his own father, and forces him to abdicate. Not exactly your classic Father's Day picnic. But it gets worse, much worse. Ottoman tradition at the time allowed a new sultan to eliminate rival claimants. You're thinking, oh, so a few discreet poisonings. Nom Selim executes 7 of his brothers and dozens of their sons' children, toddlers, even just to ensure there are no future threats to his rule. The dungeons run red. The palace servants walk quietly. No one laughs too loudly. Your mainstream historical fact, Selim, was the first Ottoman ruler to assume the title of Caliph Supreme, religious leader of the Islamic world, after conquering Egypt and the remnants of the Abbasid Caliphate. This wasn't just a title. It gave him spiritual clout across the Muslim world, and oh boy did he wield it like a club. His military campaigns are as ruthless as his family politics. In 1514, he invades Persia to fight the Safavid Empire. The Battle of Chaldiran is legendary cannons versus cavalry, Ottoman discipline versus Safavid zeal. Selim wins decisively and adds eastern Anatolia to his realm. But before marching, he orders the mass execution of tens of thousands of Alevis and Shiites in his own lands. The number is debated, but estimates hover around 40,000. His reasoning: they're potential traitors, supporters of the Persian enemy. The method: often beheading, sometimes burning. Historians still argue whether this was cold strategy or pure sectarian hatred. And then there's Egypt. Selim marches south and takes on the Mamluk Sultanate. These are no amateurs. The Mamluks ruled Egypt for centuries with a long legacy of military power. Selim crushes them, quickly, efficiently. He captures Cairo, brings the last Abbasid Caliph back to Constantinople, and ends over 250 years of Mamluk rule. Quirky tidbit: after defeating the Mamluks, Selim supposedly had the last Mamluk sultan paraded through the streets on a donkey wearing women's clothing. Petty, definitely. Effective? Unfortunately, yes. Now imagine this. You're an ambassador from Europe arriving at Topkapi Palace. You're met not with musicians and dancers, but the heads of rebels lined up on pikes. The scent of roasting lamb mixes with the iron tang of drying blood. Selim meets you, dark-bearded, silent eyes like frozen ink. You speak. He nods. You fumble your words. He blinks. You hear a distant scream and decide, yes, trade treaties sound excellent, no need to delay. Yet here's the thing, Selim isn't unhinged. He's meticulous. His brutality is targeted. Cold, yes, but calculated. He reforms taxation, builds mosques, secures trade routes, and modernizes the army. The empire under him isn't just larger, it's sharper, faster, more centralized. But no one feels safe, not even his own son. That son is Suleiman, who eventually earns the nickname the Magnificent. But before that, he lives under constant threat. He keeps his advisors close and his boots laced. After all, when your dad murders your uncle's cousins and 7 brothers to become king, you sleep with one eye open. And here's where the scholarly debate kicks in. Was Selim's cruelty a necessary evil to stabilize the Ottomans during a volatile time? Or did he go further than anyone before him, setting a precedent for the dynasty's darkest moments? Some historians argue he was simply playing by the rules. Others say he rewrote them in blood. You pause now at the edge of Selim's mausoleum in Istanbul. It's beautiful, elegant Arabic calligraphy, gold leaf, and soft light filtering through colored glass. He rests in silence, wrapped in imperial green silk. No heads, no screams, just stillness. But the walls remember. Selim, the Grim, ruled for only 8 years, yet his shadow stretches across centuries. He centralized power, crushed rebellion, rewrote empire boundaries, and normalized execution as family management. So when you read about Ottoman glories, golden domes, fragrant gardens, tiled courtyards, remember the hand that forged them sometimes dripped with blood, and sometimes it smiled while doing so. Your boots now press into icy dirt. You've moved north, far north, into the misty lands of fjords, long nights, and legends wrapped in wolf pelts. This is Scandinavia, but not the peaceful IKEA version. No. This is 16th century Sweden, where the air crackles with cold steel and colder ambition. You're entering the realm of King Erik the Fortnightly, a monarch so paranoid, so erratic, that even his breakfast feared him. Erik reigns from 1560 to 1568, a brief but chaotic chapter in Swedish history. His father Gustav Vasa had liberated Sweden from Danish control and founded a powerful new dynasty. Erik, he took that foundation and turned it into a paranoid fever dream. When he took the throne, he looked the part. Tall, intelligent, multilingual, a fan of astrology and art. A true Renaissance king. But there was something behind the eyes. Something twitchy. You notice it in how he scans the room, like everyone's holding a dagger behind their back. Spoiler, they kinda were. But then again, Erik didn't exactly make friends. From the moment he became king, he distrusted the Swedish nobility, especially one family, the Sturers. Powerful, wealthy, well-liked, and worst of all, not afraid to criticize the king. Erik's solution, not diplomacy, not alliances. He starts spying, interrogating, accusing. Then execution. In 1567, he orders the Stura murders, a bloody moment that defines his reign. He arrests several members of the family, holds them in Uppsala Castle, and in a fit of rage possibly, during a full-on psychotic break, kills them himself. Yes, personally, sword in hand. One victim, Nils Stura, had already been stabbed and left for dead. Erik reportedly returned, leaned over the body and stabbed him again, just to be sure. His court stood frozen. His advisors quietly moved their valuables to safer places. Mainstream historical fact. The Stura murders led to massive political fallout. Nobles began openly plotting against Erik. His own brothers, especially John, saw an opportunity. The crown was suddenly up for grabs. But before we go full Game of Thrones, let's back up. Because Erik didn't start this paranoid. He was actually brilliant in many ways. He worked on a new Swedish legal code. He introduced state-sponsored education. He supported the arts. And he really wanted to marry Elizabeth Ryan of England. You heard that right. He sent proposal letters, gifts, even a miniature portrait of himself. Elizabeth politely declined. Several times. Historians still argue whether this was an ambitious diplomatic play or a lonely king shooting his shot. Either way, he didn't take rejection well. Quirky tidbit. After being rejected by Queen Elizabeth, Erik secretly married a commoner named Karin Mundsdotter, a lady-in-waiting. Their wedding caused a scandal. A king marrying a peasant. Nobles were outraged. The court, already on edge from the murders, now simmered with rumors of witchcraft, mind control, or madness. And speaking of madness, Erik's mental state deteriorated rapidly. He became obsessed with poison. He thought his food was laced. He'd refuse meals, then suddenly demand feasts. He'd accuse his closest allies of treason, exile them, then beg for their forgiveness days later. One time he imprisoned his brother John for disloyalty, only to later release him and invite him to dinner. That same night, tried to poison him. The wine was switched by a servant at the last moment. Oops. Eventually, even Erik's bodyguards had enough. In 1568, his brother John finally launched a coup. With support from the nobility and the army, John marched on Stockholm. Erik fled briefly, but was captured and imprisoned in a remote castle. And here's where it gets even darker. He spent nearly a decade in captivity, moving from castle to castle. He was still technically king for part of it, but really, he was a prisoner, isolated, watching the walls, whispering to himself. One of his jailers later described him scribbling incomprehensible notes, muttering about poisons and refusing to eat unless the food was tasted first. He grew a long beard, stopped bathing, refused visitors. In 1577, Erik died almost certainly poisoned. Irony right. The man obsessed with poison for years was probably killed by it. Scholars debate whether it was ordered by his brother John, now king, or if a nervous jailer took matters into their own hands. Either way, his death ended one of the most disturbing royal declines in European history. But here's the odd legacy. Erik XIV wasn't just mad. He was a visionary, a patron of the arts, a law reformer. He saw Sweden's potential before others did. He just couldn't stop seeing ghosts in every mirror. His story sparks scholarly debate even today. Was he truly insane beyond help? Or was he a sensitive, intelligent man, crushed by the weight of a throne he never wanted? Some historians argue he suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, though of course that diagnosis didn't exist back then. Others suggest mercury poisoning from treatments he received for syphilis may have pushed him over the edge. It's hard to say. But one thing is clear, cruelty and madness danced hand in hand in his court. Now you walk away from the crumbling stones of his last prison. Snow crunches underfoot, the wind howls through the pines, and somewhere a raven calls into the dark. You don't turn back, you've seen enough. Erik IV reminds you that not all cruelty is calculated. Sometimes it bubbles up from within, chaotic, unpredictable, and sharp as a dagger in the night. You're not in Europe anymore. The air feels heavier, smells spicier, thick with incense and sweat. You hear the clang of metal, the hiss of silk robes brushing palace floors, and the distant cry of a tortured prisoner. You've arrived in India, specifically at the towering red fort of Delhi, seat of the mighty Mughal Empire. Tonight's host, Aurangzeb, the 6th emperor of the Mughals. And if you're expecting lush poetry, grand feasts, or a gentle philosopher king, prepare for whiplash. Because Aurangzeb is a man who prays hard, fights harder, and never ever forgives. He rules from 1658 to 1707. That's nearly 50 years on the throne, which makes him one of the longest ruling emperors in Indian history. And in that half century, he doesn't just hold power, he expands it. Vastly. Under his rule, the Mughal Empire reaches its greatest territorial extent, stretching across nearly the entire Indian subcontinent. But how he achieves this? That's where the shadow falls. Aurangzeb doesn't inherit the throne peacefully. No, he steals it with blood. His father, Shah Jahan, the guy who built the Taj Mahal, falls ill in 1657. And suddenly 4 royal brothers begin circling like vultures. It's the Mughal version of musical chairs, but with armies and beheadings. Aurangzeb defeats his older brother Dara Shikoh, who was the heir apparent and a popular liberal-minded Sufi. He then executes him, parades his severed head to their imprisoned father, and declares himself emperor. You know, as one does when you want to keep family bonds strong. Mainstream historical fact, Aurangzeb's reign sees more than just expansion. He reinstates the jizya tax, a tax on non-Muslims, that his predecessors had removed. This marks a sharp return to religious conservatism. Temples are destroyed, non-Muslims barred from high office, and Sanskrit schools shuttered. You feel the cultural chill settling in like fog. Now historians still argue whether Aurangzeb's policies were purely religious or more about political control. Was he a devout zealot or simply using piety to consolidate power over a vast, diverse empire? The debate rages on. His defenders point out he funded some Hindu temples and employed Hindu generals. His critics, however, cite the destruction of over 1,000 temples as a smouldering counterpoint. Here's a fringy little tidbit for you. Aurangzeb used to copy the Quran by hand, painstakingly for sale. Not because he needed money, he was fabulously wealthy, but because he believed labor purified the soul. Imagine the emperor in his spare time, hunched over parchment, scribbling verses, while his ministers begged for his attention. But the real cruelty lies in his militarism. Aurangzeb waged constant war against Rajput's Maratha Sikhs and even former allies. The Maratha resistance led by the charismatic Shivaji would become legendary. You riding with Aurangzeb's armies, watch tens of thousands march southward deeper into the Deccan Plateau. Cities fall, villages burn. The war grinds on for 27 years. 27. That's older than your favorite Netflix password. During this campaign, Aurangzeb reportedly lived out of a tent for over a decade, sleeping on bare floors, fasting often, and praying 5 times a day. A man who saw comfort as a weakness, even as he razed whole regions to maintain control. The Sikhs too felt the weight of his wrath. He executed Guru Tegh Bahadur, the 9th Sikh Guru, in 1675. Beheaded in public for refusing to convert. His son Guru Gobind Singh would go on to militarize the Sikh community into the powerful Khalsa. Some historians call this execution the moment Aurangzeb sowed the seeds of an empire's undoing. And while his empire swelled, his personal life withered. He outlived almost everyone he loved. His sons rebelled. His court, once full of art, dance, and music under his father, turned grey with puritanical silence. Musicians fled, artists starved. Even the once glorious Mughal architecture slowed to a trickle more fortress than flourish now. And yet the man worked endlessly. He wrote over 30 handwritten Qurans, maintained one of the strictest royal schedules on record, and rarely missed a prayer. He banned alcohol, forbade music, criminalized prostitution. The Mughal court began to resemble more of a mosque than a palace, but inside that marble shell decay brewed. His constant warfare drained the treasury. The empire, too large to control, frayed at the edges. Rebellions flared like brush fires. You can feel the empire straining, pulling apart. And Aurangzeb, he keeps pushing, never stopping, never smiling. In his final years, he becomes skeletal, almost ghost-like. His letters turn philosophical. He writes, "I came alone, and I go as a stranger. I do not know who I am, nor what I have done." Not exactly the uplifting pep talk of a retiring CEO. He dies in 1707, aged 88, buried in a simple grave without a grand tomb per his wishes. No domes, no gold, just dirt and a flat stone. Maybe he thought humility would cleanse his soul, but history doesn't forget so easily. Aurangzeb's reign is still fiercely debated in India today. Some see him as a pious ruler who brought discipline and expansion. Others view him as a tyrant who destroyed the Mughal legacy with his intolerance and endless wars. You step back from his quiet grave. There's no grandeur here, just the chirping of birds, the rustling of leaves, and somewhere far off, the echoes of a man who ruled everything and died alone. His empire would unravel within 50 years. His name still feared, still controversial, still whispered in schoolbooks and shouted in debates. You walk away slowly. The man who held all of India in his palm never let anyone forget the cost. The path ahead twists westward again, back into Europe, where castles loom like scars across green hills. Tonight you slip past ivy-covered stones and torches burning low. Your breath fogs the cold air, and there in the moonlight you see him, cloaked, imposing, dressed for war more often than peace. This is Vladislav II of Wallachia, but you may know him better by a darker name passed down through whispers and campfire tales, Vlad the Impaler. Yes, he's real, and yes, the legend only scratches the surface. Now you might be thinking, wait, didn't we already meet Vlad III Dracula? We did. But this is his cousin and rival, Vladislav II. And while he didn't get the Hollywood fame, he matched Vlad III in cruelty step for bloody step. The two of them locked in a seesaw of betrayal, revenge, and throat-cutting diplomacy, fought over the same patch of land, Wallachia, a small but strategic territory between Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Think of it like the Netflix password of the 15th century. Everyone wanted it, no one could keep it for long. Vladislav II rules 3 times between 1447 and 1456. His grip always just a bit too slippery. Each time he seizes power, the countryside groans under the weight of executions, purges, and paranoid crackdowns. He doesn't just kill enemies, he obliterates families. Entire noble lines vanish overnight. You wonder how he keeps the list straight. Mainstream historical fact. In 1447, Vladislav II rises to power after the murder of Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Impaler's father. That alone sets off a generational feud steeped in blood and spite. Vlad III escapes, goes into exile, and begins plotting his return, while Vladislav solidifies his own rule through executions and an uneasy alliance with Hungary. But alliances are fickle, especially when you build them on bones. Vladislav had a knack for playing both sides. To the Hungarians, he promised loyalty. To the Ottomans, he offered tribute. But when both demanded more, he answered with violence. His enemies tortured and mutilated. Villages suspected of harboring rebels burned to ash. And then Vlad returns. In 1456, Vlad the Impaler launches a surprise invasion, catching Vladislav completely off guard. The two cousins finally meet in open battle near Târgoviște, and you can feel the tension like a blade at your neck. Here's the twist: they duel personally. 2 armored men circling in front of their armies, each driven by years of betrayal. Steel clashes, horses scream, and Vlad wins. He kills Vladislav on the battlefield, possibly with his own hands, and reclaims the throne. Fringe tidbit. According to a few chroniclers, Vladislav's body was left to rot on the battlefield, deliberately. A message to any would-be challengers: the price of power here is not just death, it's humiliation. Now let's zoom out for a moment. Wallachia during this time is a pressure cooker. Caught between Christian Europe and the expanding Muslim Ottoman Empire, local rulers don't have the luxury of diplomacy. Every year you either pay tribute or get invaded. And if you're weak, your head ends up on a spike. Vladislav II's rule reflects that desperation. He isn't just cruel for cruelty's sake. He's trying to survive like a man holding a rabid dog by the throat. But the problem is, when you lead with terror, you teach others to rule the same way. He didn't just make enemies, he manufactured nightmares. And yet historians still argue whether Vladislav II was any crueler than the times demanded. Some records paint him as a just ruler who punished corrupt nobles and enforced the law with a firm hand. Others say he was paranoid, merciless, and every bit the monster Vlad III became famous for. There's one obscure account, a tattered letter barely legible, that claims Vladislav once drowned an entire rebel village by diverting a river. No spike, no fire, just silence. You picture it now: water rushing screams, muffled homes, swept away like leaves. That story's still debated, but what's clear is this: Vladislav II ruled with fear, and in the end, fear turned on him. When you trace his bloodline, there's almost nothing left. His descendants, if any survived, fade into obscurity. No grand tomb, no epic poems, just a few scorched pages in dusty archives, and the legacy of a man eclipsed by his own cousin's shadow. Still, if Vlad the Impaler hadn't been there to outshine him with all those Hollywood stakes and capes, we might remember Vladislav II as the nightmare prince of Wallachia. You step back from the muddy fields of Târgoviște, the echo of battle fading behind you. The air smells of rust and pine. The moonlight turns the fog silver. Sometimes history isn't about who was cruelest. Sometimes it's just about who survived long enough to be remembered. The ground crunches underfoot as you move north. Colder now. The wind carries the scent of frost and something darker iron perhaps, or spilled secrets. You cross through forest and fen, past black rivers and wind-whipped towers, until you reach the edge of the known world in the Middle Ages Scandinavia. Tonight, you're not here for fjords or folklore. You've come to meet a man whose name chilled even Viking blood, Eric of Pomerania, King of Norway, Denmark and Sweden. Grand titles for someone history often overlooks. But oh, he earns his place in this hall of cruelty. Eric begins life in 1381 as a mere duke, Eric of Pomerania. But fortune and one particularly ambitious queen change everything. His grand aunt, Queen Margaret the Fern of Denmark, adopts him and sets him up as heir to what becomes the Kalmar Union, a triple kingdom that unites Denmark, Norway and Sweden under one crown. At first, things look promising. Young Eric is crowned King of Norway in 1389, then of Denmark and Sweden a few years later. 3 thrones, 1 crown. Sounds like the beginning of a fairy tale. But you know better by now. You've been walking this crooked road long enough to recognize the early signs of megalomania. Mainstream historical fact. Eric's rule is marked by heavy taxation, relentless wars, and absolute refusal to compromise. The Swedish and Danish nobilities chafe under his demands. Norwegian peasants revolt. Merchants whisper behind their ledgers. And Eric, he responds with brutal crackdowns and more taxes. One quirky tidbit, Eric builds a custom pirate base on the island of Gotland. Yes, an actual pirate stronghold. After being booted from Sweden and Denmark later in life, he runs a rogue fleet from this hideout raiding merchant ships and collecting tolls like a medieval Jack Sparrow, only with less eyeliner and more righteous fury. But during his actual reign, cruelty is the rule, not the exception. He dismisses advisors, alienates nobles, and starts executing dissenters, often in public, with methods designed not just to punish, but to humiliate. One Swedish noble is said to have been dragged through the streets in chains for days, then hanged upside down until he died from exposure. Another is locked in a stockade and force-fed salted fish with no water until his organs began to fail. You shiver. The wind feels colder now, doesn't it? Historians still argue whether Eric's cruelty stemmed from insecurity or arrogance. Some say he was trying to stamp out rebellion before it spread, harsh but strategic. Others believe he simply couldn't handle the pressure of ruling 3 fractious kingdoms and lashed out at anyone who dared challenge his fragile ego. His political instincts weren't exactly sharp either. He supports the anti-pope Benedict XIII during the Great Western Schism, alienating the majority of Catholic Europe. He bans the Hanseatic League from Danish ports. Think of it like banning Amazon deliveries from your country. Trade plummets, the economy collapses, towns riot. Eric's response: more taxes, more executions. You see the pattern. Eventually, even his staunchest allies abandon him. In 1439, the Kalmar Union simply boots him off the throne. All 3 kingdoms, fed up and broke, tell Eric to take his crown and go. He refuses, of course, clings to power like a barnacle, but he's forced into exile anyway. Now here's where it gets even weirder. Instead of disappearing into obscurity, Eric sets up his pirate kingdom on Gotland. He spends the next decade robbing merchant ships in the Baltic, ransoming nobles, and occasionally sending angry letters to the thrones that betrayed him. It's a bizarre epilogue, equal parts petty and legendary. Picture it, a former king, now a maritime menace sitting in a sea-stormed fortress, drinking mead and plotting revenge, long white beard whipping in the wind. It's like Game of Thrones meets Waterworld, but real. And even after all that, he manages to slither back into power, sort of. In 1442, he's invited to return to Pomerania as Duke, his original title. He rules there until his death in 1459, probably still dreaming of reclaiming his triple crown. There's no dramatic death for Eric, no battlefield glory, no royal execution. He just dies, old, bitter and forgotten by the very kingdoms he once ruled. Yet the legacy lingers. In Sweden, he's remembered as Eric of Pommern, the tyrant who taxed and tormented. In Denmark, he's the failed successor who squandered a powerful queen's legacy. And in Norway, well, they barely speak his name. But step onto Gotland today and locals might still tell tales of the exiled king who became a pirate, who turned royal disgrace into a second act of defiance, who proved that even when the crown is taken, the sword can still be sharp. You stand on a cliff overlooking the Baltic Sea. The waves crash against the rocks below. Somewhere out there centuries ago, Eric's ships patrolled the horizon, black sails catching the wind like wings of vengeance. You pull your cloak tighter, because sometimes the most dangerous kings aren't the ones sitting on thrones, they're the ones with nothing left to lose. The wind shifts. Leaves scatter like old secrets, and you descend once more south toward the Alps. You pass moss-covered stones, narrow mountain passes, and cold streams whispering through pine. And then at last, the foothills give way to something colder, harder medieval Italy, land of city-states poisoned wine and dynasties as ruthless as they are rich. Tonight, you step into the gilded nightmare of Ezzelino III da Romano, one of the most feared warlords of the 13th century. The man Dante himself placed in hell in the Divine Comedy, and not just anywhere, the river of boiling blood reserved for tyrants. Yes, that's the caliber of cruelty we're dealing with. Ezzelino rules northern Italy like a medieval Darth Vader. He begins his climb to power as the son of a minor noble in the Veneto region. Smart, educated, fluent in Latin. But where other boys dream of glory, Ezzelino dreams of control. Cold, calculating, and deeply devout in the creepiest way possible, he believes God has chosen him to purge the world of sinners by fireblade and siege engine. Mainstream historical fact. In the 1230s, Ezzelino allies with Emperor Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor himself. Frederick grants Ezzelino vast power as his vicar in northern Italy, giving him command over cities like Verona, Vicenza, and Padua. These aren't just towns, they're economic engines, cultural centers, and dens of rebellious nobles. And Ezzelino treats them like his personal hunting grounds. You ride into one of these cities with him. At first the people cheer, maybe this new lord will be better than the last. Spoiler, he's worse. The executions start immediately. Nobles are arrested for vague conspiracies, their lands confiscated, their families imprisoned, sometimes burned, sometimes blinded, sometimes locked in towers without food or light until madness sets in. Ezzelino doesn't do mercy. He collects enemies like trophies. Fringe tidbit. One tale claims that in the town of Feltre, he massacres 11,000 people in a single campaign, including women and children. That number is still debated, but the scale of his violence is not. He turns castles into charnel houses, makes monks dig their own graves, builds underground dungeons so packed with prisoners the air turns toxic. And the worst part, he keeps it all eerily organized. This isn't chaos, it's cruelty with a filing system. Historians still argue whether Ezzelino was a religious fanatic or a political genius or both. Some say he genuinely believed he was purging the wicked to prepare for Christ's return. Others argue he was simply using theology as a smokescreen to consolidate power. There's this chilling moment, a letter written in his own hand where he refers to himself not as Lord, not as Count, but as the scourge of God. Not even pretending to be nice. He sees himself as a tool of divine vengeance. And yet cities submit to him. Why? Because resistance means annihilation. Period. Ezzelino builds an army of German mercenaries loyal only to him and pays them well. They torch villages, besiege fortresses, and carry out unspeakable orders without blinking. You imagine one of them now mud-caked armor, cold eyes torch in hand, dragging a merchant family from their cellar because someone whispered they once served a rival lord. There's one moment, half legend, half fact, that sticks with you. After conquering the town of Brescia, Ezzelino is said to invite the local nobles to a feast. They show up wary but hopeful. They are served fine wine, meat, music, and then one by one he has them dragged from the hall and tortured, in full view of the others. Their screams the dessert course. Even the emperor grows uneasy. Frederick dies in 1250, and with him, Ezzelino's imperial shield vanishes. Suddenly, the cities rise. A coalition of northern Italian forces unites to bring him down. The Pope himself calls for a crusade against Ezzelino. That's rare. When the Pope says you're worse than the Saracens, it's a bad day. In 1259, the final campaign begins. Ezzelino, older but still ruthless, marches on Milan with one last army. He besieges the city, slaughters towns around it, but underestimates the resistance. At the Battle of Cassano d'Adda, he is wounded and captured. And here's the twist: he refuses to speak, refuses to eat. Locked in a stone cell, Ezzelino starves himself to death rather than stand trial or repent. You wonder if it was pride or fear, or just the final act of a man who would rather die than admit defeat. After his death, his body is buried quietly. No monument, no ceremony. His lands are divided, his name scrubbed from public records. But you can't erase a shadow that deep. Dante Alighieri, writing decades later, puts Ezzelino in the seventh circle of hell, the place for tyrants and warlords who bathe in rivers of boiling blood. You see it now in your mind's eye, Ezzelino submerged to his throat, glaring at you with eternal fury, still convinced he was right. The Italian city-states remember him as a ghoul in human form. Mothers warn their children, obey, or Ezzelino will come for you. Priests spit his name in sermons. And yet, in some dark corners, his tactics become a blueprint for those who follow. Iron rule. No forgiveness. No loose ends. You leave Verona behind. The towers cast long shadows. Somewhere beneath them, the bones of the tyrant still lie. Silent. Watching. Because sometimes cruelty is not a mistake or a flaw. Sometimes it's the entire strategy. You follow a dusty road now crossing into arid plains tinged with gold, where the sun presses down like judgment and time feels brittle. The wind picks up grit from the earth. History here has sharp edges. You're in the Balkans now, where empires collide, borders bleed, and one name echoes, like a curse whispered across generations: Vlad III, Dracula the Impaler. Yes, that Dracula. You've heard the vampire stories, capes, bats, castles. Forget all that. Tonight you meet the real man. And believe me, the truth is far darker than fiction. Vlad was born in 1431 in Transylvania, the son of Vlad II Dracul, a noble tied to the Order of the Dragon, a chivalric league sworn to defend Christendom. So Dracula literally means son of the dragon. That's cool. Until you realize the real dragon here is Vlad himself. As a boy, Vlad is handed over to the Ottoman Empire as a hostage, standard noble practice. He spends his formative years in enemy territory, a political pawn kept alive, only so long as his father behaves. He learns languages, strategy, swordplay, and vengeance. Lots and lots of vengeance. Mainstream historical fact: Vlad rules Wallachia, a region in modern-day Romania, 3 separate times between 1448 and 1476. His reigns punctuated by exile, betrayal, and most famously, an obsession with impalement. And yes, it's exactly what you think it is. But this wasn't mere cruelty. Vlad used terror as statecraft. He understood something most kings didn't fear is efficient. You don't need a garrison if your reputation does the work for you. One fringe tidbit. In 1462, as the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II invades Wallachia with a massive army, he finds a forest of impaled corpses, tens of thousands of them staked upright and rotting under the sun. It's not just horrifying, it's psychological warfare. Mehmed reportedly turns back without fighting. Who wants to conquer a man who does that to his enemies? And Vlad's victims aren't just invaders. They include local boyars, nobles who betray him, German merchants who defy his taxes, and even peasants he suspects of disloyalty. There's a legend part, apocryphal part, likely true of Vlad, inviting feuding noble families to a grand feast, locking the doors, and having the entire hall set on fire. No messy trials, just ash. Historians still argue whether Vlad was a patriot or a psychopath. Romanian folklore paints him as a hero who fought for independence, resisted Ottoman rule, and defended Christianity. Western sources, especially German and Hungarian ones, describe him as a blood-soaked monster driven by paranoia and sadism. The truth lies somewhere in the middle, Or maybe both are true. You trudge beside him now, his armor blackened a stake strapped to his horse. He's not a large man, but there's a stillness to him that screams danger. His eyes don't blink when he speaks. His men adore him or fear him enough to obey. It's hard to tell which is which. There's one account that says Vlad would place a golden cup at a central fountain in Targoviste, his capital. Anyone could drink from it without fear of theft. Why? Because the penalty was impalement. And the cup was never stolen. Not once. That's the twisted beauty of his rule. Cities were safe. Crime was nearly non-existent. Roads were secure. He rebuilt churches, minted fair coinage, and insisted on honesty from tax collectors. He was a brutal tyrant, yes, but a competent one. And yet betrayal always circles back. In his later years, Vlad is captured, imprisoned, and ultimately betrayed by allies. He returns to power briefly, but is killed in battle in 1476. His head is sent to the Sultan in Constantinople, pickled, according to one account, as proof of death. No one knows exactly where his body lies. His supposed grave at Snagov Monastery has never yielded remains. Some believe his bones were moved. Others whisper darker theories that Vlad walks still. That's the thing. Dracula never quite dies, does he? The vampire myth emerges centuries later, heavily inspired by Vlad's legend. Bram Stoker borrows the name and a taste for blood, but the real man was never undead. He just understood that fear lingers longer than flesh, and so it does. In Romanian schoolbooks, he's taught as a protector. In tourist brochures, he's a spooky attraction. But in the shadows of ruined castles and blood-soaked fields, Vlad the Impaler remains something else, a warning. Because when a ruler believes cruelty is a virtue, the crown becomes a weapon. You stand now at the edge of one of his forests. The stakes are gone, but the earth remembers. The wind carries his name, and you finally understand why the Ottoman army turned back. Your journey turns north now into the frostbitten veins of Scandinavia, where daylight is brief and memory long. The sky bruises with cloud, and you cross lakes so still they seem carved from glass. Here in the kingdom of Sweden, beneath crowns and battle axes, lives a name etched in dread, King Erik XIV. Born into the glittering chaos of royal ambition in 1533, Erik is the son of Gustav Vasa, the man who freed Sweden from Danish rule and founded a royal dynasty. Erik grows up in the shadow of revolution, raised to believe he's special, chosen even. And that belief, it grows teeth. Erik becomes king in 1560. Young, educated, tall, striking, fond of astrology and opulent clothing. If you met him early on, you might like him. But look a little closer and the cracks begin to spider. Mainstream historical fact. Erik XIV's reign is dominated by paranoia, made worse by a bitter rivalry with the powerful Stura family Swedish nobles with ties to the former regime. Erik fears plots everywhere in his court, in foreign embassies, even within his own bloodline. By 1567, his paranoia mutates into madness. One spring afternoon, he invites several Sturas to his castle under peaceful terms. They arrive dressed in velvet and caution. He greets them warmly, smiles. They're given rooms, food. Days pass, and then he snaps. Erik, armed with a dagger, personally murders Niels Stura, stabbing him repeatedly in a stone chamber. His guards follow suit, executing several other nobles. The king watches, silent. Then another twist, he returns to his rooms and breaks down completely, reportedly weeping and wailing for hours. Historians still argue whether this was a planned purge or the spontaneous collapse of an unwell mind. Some believe Erik suffered from schizophrenia or bipolar disorder. Others claim he faked instability to justify eliminating threats. What's certain, after that massacre, Sweden begins to shudder under its king. You walk the corridors of his castle now. The air is cold. Thick tapestries fail to muffle the echoes. You pass portraits with eyes too wide, too watchful. Erik believed stars controlled destinies, his throne ring, inscribed with astrological symbols. He consulted horoscopes before decisions, trusting celestial charts over advisors. Fringe, tidbit. He even developed a secret language, a blend of Swedish Latin and ciphered symbols to communicate with a few trusted courtiers. Imagine trying to run a kingdom through riddles and cryptograms. And then there's his obsession with bloodlines. Erik falls in love with Karin Mundsdotter, a commoner. Against all advice, he marries her and crowns her queen, shocking the aristocracy. It's romantic, sure, but also strategic. Erik distrusts nobles and sees Karin, pure of political ties, as the only person he can truly rely on. Cue royal meltdown. His brothers, especially John, Duke of Finland, rebel. John, imprisoned earlier by Erik, now rises against him. The nobles, fed up with instability and bloodshed, join John's cause. In 1568, Erik is overthrown. Not killed, just quietly removed like a cracked mirror you don't want to shatter all the way. He spends the next 8 years in captivity, passed between castles like a cursed artifact. His behavior grows erratic. He suspects poison in every dish, refuses certain foods, refuses silence, talks to unseen spirits, and then, well, things get darker. One day in 1577, Erik eats a bowl of pea soup. Not unusual, but this one, according to most accounts, is laced with arsenic. Within hours, the former king is dead. To this day, we're not entirely sure who ordered the poisoning. Was it John? Was it the nobles? Was it a mercy or murder? What we know is this Erik the left behind a nation scarred, a court that tiptoed, and a throne that no longer trusted its own heirs. His name was so cursed that future kings avoided using Erik for centuries. No one wanted the ghost. You stand at the edge of his memory now. A quiet grave, a lost ring, a single drop of dried wax on parchment covered in symbols no one remembers how to read. Because cruelty isn't always loud. Sometimes it's paranoia that whispers until it screams. Erik didn't build torture towers. He didn't burn villages. He turned his own mind into a weapon and unleashed it on his people. And in the silence he left behind, you finally hear the saddest sound, a crown rolling across stone. The road twists again, this time toward green isles and ancient grudges, where fog rolls low over moors and voices carry old feuds. You step ashore in Scotland, a land of clans and cold steel, and not far behind you, cloaked in red fury and royal paranoia, marches King James II. Born in 1430, James ascends to the throne at the tender age of 6 after his father. James Thom is assassinated in front of his own queen. So from the very start, young James is taught 2 lessons. Never trust your nobles and rule with a fist, not a handshake. Mainstream historical fact. The first decade of James's reign is controlled by powerful regents, especially the Black Douglases, one of the most feared noble families in Scottish history. They were rich, militarily strong, and often just better at kinging than the actual king. So when James comes of age, he sets out to break the Douglas grip. But not by politics, oh no. James prefers blunt solutions. One evening in 1452, he invites William VIII, Earl of Douglas, the most powerful man in the kingdom, to Stirling Castle for peace talks. What a lovely idea. Fringe tidbit. Before the meeting, James swears on a holy relic that William will leave unharmed. Religious relics were like the lie detector tests of the day. And then James personally stabs William to death at the dinner table. 3 dozen more stab wounds follow courtesy of the king's men. Blood on the tapestries. Broken oaths echoing against stained glass. The relic probably rolls into a corner embarrassed. Historians still argue whether this was a spontaneous act or part of a long-laid trap. Some claim James felt threatened by a secret Douglas alliance with England. Others say it was pure emotional combustion, James losing control. Whatever the reason, James doesn't stop there. Over the next few years, he wages open war on the remaining Douglas lords, besieging castles, confiscating lands and crushing opposition, with a mix of cannon fire and cold intimidation. He burns the bridges, both literal and diplomatic. And speaking of cannon fire, this king is absolutely obsessed with gunpowder. You walk with him now into a smoky battlefield. The air hums with the strange music of early artillery. James was one of the first Scottish monarchs to invest heavily in cannons, even giving them names like their cherished pets, the Lion, the Black Margaret, and most famously, Mons Meg. Mons Meg was no subtle weapon. Built in Flanders, she could fire a 330-pound cannonball over 2 miles. James adored her, paraded her around like a royal mascot, used her in sieges just to terrify enemies before the walls even cracked. But as with all things James loved, it didn't end well. In 1460, he lays siege to Roxburgh Castle, one of the last English strongholds on Scottish soil. James is there in person, boots muddy eyes fixed on the ramparts. Mons Meg is hauled into position, and then while the king stands nearby giddy as a boy at a birthday party, the cannon explodes. A metal fragment flies through the air like a hawk and rips through James's thigh, severing the bone and slicing his artery. He bleeds out on the spot in front of his entire army, in the dirt he thought would be his victory. It's a dramatic, almost Shakespearean death. Not in battle, not by sword, but felled by his own favourite weapon. As if the universe whispered, "Enough." You kneel beside the broken cannon now. It still sits on display in Edinburgh Castle, blackened and silent. Tourists take selfies with it. Children climb it. Few know the king it killed. James II left behind a kingdom more centralised, more modern, and more afraid. He crushed a noble family so dominant they'd rivaled the throne. He advanced military technology. He enforced a policy of strength that arguably made future monarchs safer. But he also broke faith-spilled blood on relics and turned diplomacy into theatre. Because sometimes cruelty isn't about how many fall, but who you choose to betray when they're at your table. You turn now, hearing distant bagpipes. The mist thickens. Somewhere ahead, another king waits. This one in iron, wrapped in religion and ruin. But for now, James lies still, a cannonball resting beside a shattered crown. Your feet ache now, but the path won't pause. It turns toward the heart of Europe through alpine shadows and whispering cloisters, and leads you into a world wrapped in incense and iron discipline. Welcome to the Holy Roman Empire, a patchwork of principalities stitched together by war politics and occasional divine intervention. And sitting atop it all like a crow on a broken cross is Charles IX of France. Wait, France. Yes, we're detouring slightly, because though Charles IX was never crowned Holy Roman Emperor, his reign during the French Wars of Religion earns him a place in any hall of cruelty. His decisions, hesitations, and signature on a single piece of paper would lead to one of the worst massacres in medieval Europe. Charles is born in 1550, a Valois prince in a kingdom split by faith. His mother is Catherine de' Medici, the real power behind the throne, and a woman who knows exactly how to keep a country from flying apart, just barely. Charles becomes king at 10. He spends much of his early reign being ruled rather than ruling. Mainstream historical fact. France during Charles's time is in open religious conflict between Catholics and Huguenots French Protestants. The wars are bitter, cyclical, and fueled by noble rivalries, just as much as piety. Charles tries at first to be a king of peace. He hosts the marriage of his sister Margot to the Protestant Henry of Navarre in 1572, a politically charged union meant to heal wounds. Huguenot nobles flood Paris for the wedding. It's a trap. Just days later, a failed assassination attempt on Huguenot leader Admiral Gaspard de Coligny sends tensions soaring. Rumours fly. Catholic mobs begin gathering. Catherine whispers to her son better to strike first, and Charles, exhausted, cornered, afraid, signs the order. Fringe tidbit. He's said to have shouted, "Then kill them all, so no one will be left to blame me." That line, whether apocryphal or not, feels chillingly real. The result, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre. It begins on the night of August 23rd, 1572. Church bells toll in the dark. Doors are kicked in. Blades flash. The Seine runs red. Over the next few days, thousands of Huguenots are slaughtered in Paris, men, women, children. Bodies are dumped from windows. Protestants are hunted through alleyways like game. And it spreads. Town after town, village after village. Across France, Catholics rise up convinced they have royal blessing. The death toll is still debated. Some say 3,000 in Paris alone. Others push national estimates as high as 30,000. Historians still argue whether Charles orchestrated the massacre or simply lost control? Was he a weak puppet, a terrified boy, or a young king who finally snapped beneath the weight of a kingdom he couldn't unify? One thing's certain: he never recovered. After the massacre, Charles deteriorates. Mentally, physically. He becomes erratic, haunted by nightmares and guilt. He reportedly hears phantom screams and dreams of blood. His health collapses. He coughs constantly, sometimes blood, and slips into what modern doctors might call tuberculosis. And then the voices. He claims to hear his victims. He isolates himself. His mother, ever practical, starts preparing for her next son's reign. Charles IX dies in 1574 at the age of 23. Young, racked by disease, and if the stories are true, mad with guilt. He leaves behind a France more fractured than he found it, a throne smeared with suspicion, and a family dynasty on the brink of extinction. You stand now in the courtyard of the Louvre where the massacre began. The palace is grand tourists with cameras lining the halls. But you look at the windows above and imagine the flicker of torches, the hurried whispers, the first scream that shattered the night. And you wonder what's worse: a king who kills coldly, or one who signs a death sentence in fear, then listens to it echo for the rest of his life. Cruelty doesn't always come in black armor. Sometimes it's dressed in silk, shivering in the shadow of a powerful mother whispering yes when it should say no. You move on. The cobblestones still glisten. You push deeper into shadows now, where empires bleed into one another, and crowns are stitched together with conquest ambition and just a pinch of madness. The year is 1494. You're in Spain. The golden age of exploration is dawning, but within the towering palaces of Castile, a far older darkness takes shape. And at its center sits Ferdinand II of Aragon, ruling beside his infamous wife, Queen Isabella the Fairest of Castile. Ah yes, the Catholic monarchs. You've probably heard their names linked to grand shining things. The unification of Spain, Columbus's voyage to the New World, the glittering courts of a burgeoning empire. But behind the polished portraits and holy banners lies a reality stained with fear fire and forced conversion. Mainstream historical fact. Ferdinand and Isabella's marriage in 1469 unites two of Spain's most powerful kingdoms. Politically, it's brilliant. Romantically, let's just say their pillow talk probably included a lot of power mapping. Together they reshape Spain with one singular goal: religious unity. That sounds lovely until you remember that in their era, unity meant eradication of difference. In 1478, they create a weapon to enforce this vision, the Spanish Inquisition. Now, to be fair, they didn't invent inquisitions. The Catholic Church had been conducting them for centuries, but Ferdinand and Isabella, they industrialize it, institutionalize it, turn it into a roaring engine of paranoia and persecution. And guess who they appoint as its grand architect? Tomás de Torquemada, a Dominican friar with a taste for torment and a library of torture devices. You creep now through the narrow corridors of a 15th century tribunal chamber. The air is thick with candle smoke and whispers. The accused are converted Jews and Muslims, conversos, and Moriscos suspected of secretly practicing their old faiths. Fringe tidbit. Some people were accused based on whether they ate chickpeas, which were considered suspiciously Jewish. Yes, chickpeas. Trials are secretive, torture is routine, confessions are extracted with pliers, ropes, racks. Even the innocent often confess just to stop the pain. Once convicted, you're paraded in the auto da fe, a public ritual of penance or punishment. Sometimes just a sermon, sometimes the stake. Ferdinand and Isabella don't micromanage the torture, they don't need to. They just approve the machinery and let it run. And run it does for centuries. Historians still argue the exact death toll of the Inquisition. Thousands, tens of thousands. What's certain is that fear becomes a form of governance and cruelty becomes policy. But Ferdinand's grip doesn't end at religion. In 1492, the same year Columbus sails west, Ferdinand and Isabella expel all Jews from Spain. Not convert, not coexist. Expel. Estimates say 200,000 people are forced to flee, many stripped of possessions, forced to choose between faith and survival. Some convert. Some perish on the road. Some vanish into the pages of forgotten family trees. This is where modern Spain is born, not just in ships and gold, but in smoke and silence. And yet Ferdinand isn't done. After Isabella's death in 1504, he clings to power, marries again, schemes in the shadows to control Castile. His daughter Joanna Juana la Loca becomes queen, but her mental instability and Ferdinand's lust for continued power mean she's essentially imprisoned, declared unfit to rule. Historians still argue whether Joanna was truly mad or simply a political inconvenience. Some letters suggest grief, others hint at manipulation. What's clear, Ferdinand uses her instability to claim regency and continue his rule, brushing aside even blood to hold the reins. He dies in 1516, his legacy vast. He set the foundation for the Spanish Empire. He funded voyages that would redraw the globe, and he unleashed institutions that would spread terror from Seville to Lima. You sit now beneath the arches of Granada's Alhambra, once a jewel of Muslim Spain, now hollowed out and Christianized under his rule. The tiles still shimmer, but the water in the fountains seems quieter, as if mourning all it has seen. Ferdinand wasn't the executioner. He wasn't even always the voice calling for blood. But he was the architect, the approver, the builder of systems so cruel they became self-sustaining. Cruelty doesn't need to wield the blade. Sometimes it just signs the law and steps aside. And so Spain marches forward, into gold conquest and deep shadows. You follow now past parchment maps and smoke-darkened halls. One more king awaits. And now you come to the end of the line, past crumbling battlements and whispering ruins, through centuries of crowned savagery and velvet-lined betrayals. One final king stands at the edge of this long procession, Vlad III, Dracula, better known to the weary modern mind as Vlad the Impaler. You hear the name and your imagination bolts straight to fangs, capes and coffins. But tonight there's no gothic fantasy, just a man born into chaos, sharpened by war and remembered in equal parts as hero and monster. Vlad is born in 1431 in Transylvania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary. His father, Vlad II, Dracul, is a member of the Order of the Dragon, a Christian knightly order sworn to defend Europe from the expanding Ottoman Empire. Dracula simply means son of Dracul. Mainstream historical fact: Vlad spends much of his youth as an Ottoman hostage alongside his brother Radu. Sultan Murad II keeps them as political insurance proof their father won't betray him. It's here that Vlad learns Turkish Islamic customs and the brutal calculus of empire. He also learns that mercy is rarely repaid. When Vlad returns to Wallachia to reclaim his throne, it's not with grand speeches or glowing pageantry. It's with blood. In a region caught between the Ottomans, Hungarians, Saxon merchants and squabbling boyars, nobles, Vlad has one governing principle: make an example. So he does again and again. The stories come in fast, like arrows in fog. Whole forests of impaled corpses planted outside towns to warn invaders. A banquet where he invites his scheming nobles, questions their loyalty, and then has them all stabbed and impaled. That's one way to clear the guest list. Fringe tidbit. One legend claims Vlad once dipped his bread in the blood of his victims, calmly eating lunch among a writhing field of dying enemies. Most historians treat this as wartime propaganda, but it's still printed in old Saxon pamphlets like twisted fairy tales. To the Ottomans, he is a menace. In 1462, Sultan Mehmed II, the same sultan who conquered Constantinople, marches into Wallachia with a massive force to unseat him. But one night the Sultan finds something far worse than any battlefield: a forest of over 20,000 impaled bodies, rotting in silence, stretching out for miles. Soldiers weep, horses spook. The Sultan retreats. And yet to many in Romania, Vlad is a national hero, a fierce defender of Christian Europe, a leader who didn't bow to foreign powers. His name is etched into folklore, not as a villain, but as a wall of fire that once held back an empire. Historians still argue whether Vlad's cruelty was psychopathic or strategic. Some point to medieval customs of harsh justice. Others See trauma from his childhood captivity, the betrayal of allies, and the constant threat of invasion? Maybe it's both. He dies in 1476, likely betrayed in battle. Some say he was killed by his own men. Others believe it was enemy saboteurs. His head is sent to the Ottomans in a jar of honey like a gory resignation letter. His grave still debated. Some claim he was buried at Snagov Monastery, a quiet place surrounded by water. Others think the tomb is empty, or cursed, or moved. The man becomes the myth, and then centuries later Bram Stoker spins him into something else entirely: Dracula the vampire. Immortal, thirsting, undead. But your footsteps tonight aren't in fiction. They're planted in the soil of real cruelty. Vlad didn't drink blood. He drank fear. He built walls of corpses, not castles in the Carpathians. And he did it not in shadows, but in full view of a trembling world. So you stand now in the cool night air, looking up at the stars Vlad once saw. Perhaps he wondered if the heavens judged him. Or maybe, like so many rulers before him, he simply believed cruelty was the only language power understands. And as you turn to leave, the wind whispers his name, not with fangs, but with fire. And now, you're back. Out of the past, out of the echo chambers of ancient halls, and into the gentle hush of your own space again. The kings are quiet now, their bloodied crowns set down, their whispering courts long buried beneath the earth. You've wandered through 1,000 years of dark power, seen how cruelty wears many faces, some gilded, some broken, some hiding behind robes of holiness or duty. You've walked alongside boys who grew into monsters, generals who became tyrants, and rulers whose fear was as sharp as any blade. And still through it all, you've made it to this moment. So let your breath slow now. The battles have faded. The torches gone cold. All that remains is the hum of your room, the softness of your bed, and the quiet assurance that you don't live in their world. No war horses thunder beyond your window. No royal decree dictates your fate. Just your thoughts gently settling like dust after a storm. If your mind drifts back to impaled forests or blood-soaked banquets, remember those were stories, shadows, and even the darkest ones pass in time. So close your eyes. The wind outside is just wind. The silence is just sleep. And in the distance, no cruel kings march, only the hush of dreams finding their way to you. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.